Detective Raymond Johnson never thought his biggest challenge would come from his own colleagues. After 15 years on the force, he had seen it all. Drug busts, gang violence, domestic disputes that turned deadly. But nothing prepared him for what he faced when the chief called him into her office on a cold Tuesday morning in February. "Ray, I need someone I can trust," Chief Patricia Williams said, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "Internal Affairs needs a new director. Someone clean. Someone who can handle the heat." Ray picked up the folder and felt its weight. Inside were complaint files, incident reports, and personnel records that painted a picture he didn't want to see. Officers using excessive force, reports being buried, witnesses being intimidated. The previous Internal Affairs director had retired suddenly after just 6 months on the job. "Why me?" Ray asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you're one of the few people in this department who hasn't been touched by scandal. And because you're not afraid to do what's right even when it's hard." Ray looked through the window at the busy police station. Officers walked back and forth, talking, laughing, going about their daily routines. In a few hours, he would become the person they all feared. The cop who investigated other cops. The one who could end careers and destroy reputations. "When do I start?" he asked. "Today." Within an hour, word had spread through the station like wildfire. Ray Johnson was the new Internal Affairs director. The reactions were immediate and telling. Some officers congratulated him with genuine smiles. Others just nodded and walked away. A few gave him looks that could freeze water. Officer Tommy Martinez was one of the ones who didn't look happy. Ray had known Tommy for 8 years. They had worked patrol together when Ray was still new to the job. Tommy was the kind of cop who bent rules when it suited him. Nothing too serious. Or so Ray had thought. But now, looking at the files on his desk, he saw Tommy's name come up more than once. The Internal Affairs office was on the 3rd floor, away from the main hustle and bustle of the station. It was quiet up there. Too quiet. Ray spent his first week reading files and getting familiar with ongoing cases. 3 investigations were already in progress when he took over. All 3 involved use of force incidents that had happened in the past 6 months. The first case involved Officer Danny Rodriguez, who had been accused of using excessive force during a traffic stop. The complaint came from a college student, who claimed Danny had slammed his head against his car for no reason. Danny's report said the suspect was resisting arrest and posed a threat. The body camera footage was mysteriously corrupted. The second case was about Officer Lisa Chen, who was accused of racially profiling residents in the downtown area. Multiple complaints had been filed against her in the past year. All of them followed the same pattern. Young black men stopped for minor infractions, searched without probable cause, and released without charges. Lisa's supervisor had dismissed most of the complaints as unfounded. The third case was the one that worried Ray the most. Officer Jake Morrison had been involved in a shooting 3 months ago. A 19-year-old named Kevin Thompson had been killed during what Morrison claimed was a struggle for his weapon. Witnesses said Kevin was running away when he was shot. The case had been ruled justified by the previous Internal Affairs director, but Kevin's family had hired a lawyer and was demanding a new investigation. Morrison had been on the force for 12 years. His file was thick with complaints and commendations, in equal measure. Some people saw him as a hero cop who wasn't afraid to work the tough neighborhoods. Others saw him as a bully with a badge who enjoyed intimidating people. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but Ray's job was to find out exactly where. Ray's first meeting with Morrison didn't go well. Morrison sat in the chair across from Ray's desk with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. He was a big man, about 6 feet tall and built like a linebacker. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his shoes always shined. He looked every inch the professional police officer, but his eyes told a different story. "So you're the new guy," Morrison said without waiting to be asked to speak. "I heard you used to work patrol. That's good. At least you know what it's like out there." "I'm here to review your case, Officer Morrison, the Kevin Thompson shooting." Morrison's jaw tightened. "That case was already closed. Kid was a gangbanger who tried to take my gun. I did what I had to do to protect myself and the community." Ray opened the file and pulled out the witness statements. According to 3 witnesses, Kevin was running away when you shot him. Witnesses lie, especially in that neighborhood. They hate cops and they'll say anything to make us look bad. What about the forensic evidence? The bullet entered Kevin's back. Morrison leaned forward in his chair. He was turning around. He had my gun and he was turning to shoot me. I had a split second to react. Ray made notes as Morrison talked. The officer's story was consistent with his original report, but it didn't match the physical evidence or the witness accounts. This was going to be a difficult case to investigate, especially with Morrison's reputation in the department. After Morrison left, Ray sat alone in his office thinking about what he had gotten himself into. Being an internal affairs director meant making enemies. It meant being isolated from the very people he had called friends and colleagues for 15 years. But it also meant standing up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. The next few weeks were challenging. Ray reopened the Morrison case and began conducting new interviews with witnesses. He also started looking into the other complaints against Morrison that had been dismissed over the years. A pattern began to emerge. Morrison had a history of aggressive behavior, especially when dealing with minority suspects. Most of the complaints had been filed by Black and Hispanic residents of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Ray also discovered that Morrison had connections throughout the department. Other officers respected him, or at least feared him. He was the kind of cop who would back you up in a dangerous situation, but he was also the kind who expected loyalty in return. Several officers had witnessed questionable behavior from Morrison over the years, but none had reported it. The pressure on Ray began almost immediately. Anonymous notes started appearing on his desk. "Mind your own business," and "nobody likes a snitch" were common themes. His tires were slashed twice in the station parking lot. Phone calls to his house at all hours of the night became routine. But Ray pressed on. He interviewed Kevin Thompson's family and learned about a young man who was trying to turn his life around. Kevin had been working at a grocery store and taking night classes at the community college. He had no criminal record and no gang affiliations, despite what Morrison claimed. The truth was becoming clear, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Ray knew he was walking into a storm that could destroy his career and possibly his life. But he also knew that Kevin Thompson deserved justice, and the community deserved to know the truth about what happened that night. As Ray prepared for the annual police awards banquet, he had no idea that his investigation would soon come to a dramatic and violent head. The grand ballroom at the Riverside Hotel looked spectacular. Golden lights hung from the ceiling and round tables covered with white tablecloths filled the room. Tonight was the annual police awards banquet, the biggest event of the year for the department. Officers came dressed in their best uniforms, medals polished and shoes shining. Family members wore their finest clothes, proud to celebrate their loved ones who served the community. Ray Johnson arrived early, wanting to avoid the crowds and the awkward conversations that had become part of his daily life since taking over internal affairs. He wore his dress uniform with the detective's badge prominently displayed. The chief had asked him to sit at the head table with other department leadership. It was an honor, but it also meant he would be visible to everyone in the room. As Ray walked through the ballroom, he noticed the decorations celebrating the department's achievements over the past year. Crime rates were down in most neighborhoods. Several major drug operations had been shut down. The department had received grants for new equipment and training programs. On the surface, everything looked positive. But Ray knew the darker side of the story. His investigation into Jake Morrison had expanded over the past month. What started as a review of one shooting had become an examination of years of questionable behavior. Ray had interviewed dozens of witnesses and reviewed hundreds of pages of reports. The picture that emerged was troubling. Morrison had a pattern of using excessive force, particularly against minority suspects. Previous internal affairs investigations had been incomplete or biased. The Kevin Thompson case was the tip of the iceberg. Ray had discovered at least 6 other incidents where Morrison had used questionable tactics. In each case, the complaints had been dismissed, or the witnesses had been too intimidated to follow through. Morrison had friends in high places who had protected him for years, but tonight was supposed to be a celebration, not a time for thinking about corruption and cover-ups. Ray found his assigned seat at the head table and sat down next to Captain Rodriguez, who supervised the detective division. She gave him a friendly nod and asked how he was adjusting to his new role. "It's challenging," Ray admitted, "but necessary." "Just remember that most of us are good cops doing good work," Rodriguez said. "Don't let a few bad apples make you cynical about the whole department." Ray appreciated her words, but he wondered how many few bad apples there really were. His investigation had revealed a culture of silence that protected officers who crossed the line. Good cops stayed quiet, while bad cops got away with misconduct. It was a system that needed to change. The ballroom began to fill with people as the evening progressed. Ray watched families find their tables and officers greet each other with handshakes and jokes. Children ran between tables while their parents socialized. It was a community gathering that reminded Ray why he had become a police officer in the first place. These people believed in law and order. They trusted the police to protect them and their families. That trust made Ray's job even more important. When officers abused their power, they didn't just harm individual victims. They damaged the relationship between police and community that was essential for public safety. Every unjustified shooting, every false arrest, every act of brutality made it harder for honest cops to do their jobs effectively. Ray spotted Morrison across the room, talking loudly with a group of patrol officers. Morrison was one of those cops who commanded attention wherever he went. He was charismatic and confident, the kind of person who could make you believe anything he said. But Ray had learned not to trust appearances. Some of the worst criminals he had arrested over the years had seemed like model citizens on the surface. Morrison caught Ray's eye and raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. The gesture was clearly meant to be insulting, but Ray just nodded back politely. He wasn't going to let Morrison provoke him into a confrontation. Not here, not in front of the entire department and their families. As the evening continued, Ray noticed that Morrison was drinking heavily. He had seen at least 3 empty beer bottles at Morrison's table, and the man's voice was getting louder and his gestures more animated. Some of his friends at the table looked uncomfortable, but no, one was telling him to slow down. The award ceremony began at 8 o'clock. Chief Williams took the podium and began recognizing officers for their service and achievements. There were awards for bravery, community service, and professional excellence. Ray watched as proud families applauded their loved ones receiving recognition for their dedication to public safety. Morrison received an award for his years of service. As he walked to the podium to accept his plaque, he got a standing ovation from about half the room. The other half, including Ray, remained seated. Morrison's acceptance speech was brief, but pointed. "I've been proud to serve this community for 12 years, Morrison said into the microphone. "I've always done whatever it takes to keep our streets safe, even when that meant making tough decisions that some people didn't understand or appreciate." Ray felt like Morrison was speaking directly to him. The message was clear. Morrison wasn't going to back down or admit wrongdoing. He saw himself as a hero who was being persecuted by politically correct administrators who didn't understand real police work. After the ceremony, people began moving around the room, socializing and congratulating the award winners. Ray stayed at his table, not wanting to create awkward situations for other officers who might feel pressured to choose sides. Captain Rodriguez introduced him to her husband and teenage daughter, treating him like any other colleague. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to Ray. Morrison's table was getting rowdier as the night went on. Ray could hear loud laughter and crude jokes from across the room. Someone had brought a cooler of beer, even though alcohol wasn't supposed to be served at department events. But nobody seemed willing to tell Morrison and his friends to follow the rules. Around 9:30, Ray decided it was time to leave. He had made his appearance and shown respect for the department and the award winners. Staying longer would just increase the chances of an uncomfortable encounter with Morrison or his supporters. Ray said goodbye to Captain Rodriguez and headed toward the exit. But as he walked past Morrison's table, he heard his name being called. Not politely, but loudly and aggressively. Ray considered ignoring it and continuing to the door. but he knew that would be seen as cowardice. He turned around to face Morrison, who was standing now with a beer in his hand. "Hey, Ray," Morrison called out, using his first name instead of his rank or title. "Why don't you come over here and have a drink with us? We're celebrating real police work." The emphasis on real was clearly intended as an insult. Morrison was suggesting that internal affairs wasn't real police work, that Ray was somehow less of a cop because he investigated misconduct instead of chasing criminals. "Thanks for the invitation," Ray replied calmly. "But I was just leaving. Congratulations on your award." "Oh, come on," Morrison said, stepping away from his table and moving closer to Ray. "Don't be antisocial. We're all cops here. We should stick together." Ray could smell alcohol on Morrison's breath. The man was clearly intoxicated, which made the situation more unpredictable. Several other officers were watching now, waiting to see what would happen. Ray knew he had to handle this carefully. If he backed down, he would look weak. But if he escalated the confrontation, it could spiral out of control. "I appreciate the sentiment," Ray said, "but I think it's time for me to head home." Morrison's friendly facade dropped. His expression hardened and his voice took on an edge that Ray recognized from his interviews with Morrison's victims. "You know what I think?" Morrison said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I think you've forgotten what side you're on. I think you care more about criminals and troublemakers than you do about the officers who risk their lives every day." The ballroom was getting quieter as more people noticed the confrontation. Ray could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid. "Officer Morrison," Ray said, using Morrison's rank, to remind everyone present of the chain of command. "I think you've had a bit too much to drink. Maybe it's time for you to call it a night too." Morrison's face flushed red with anger. The suggestion that he was drunk in front of his colleagues was apparently the final insult he could tolerate. He stepped closer to Ray, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "You're nothing but a desk cop who's never done real police work. You sit in your office all day looking for ways to destroy good officers who are actually making a difference." Ray remained calm despite the provocation. He could see Chief Williams making her way across the room, obviously concerned about the developing situation. Captain Rodriguez was also approaching, along with several other supervisors, but they were still too far away to intervene if things got physical. "I'm just doing my job," Ray said simply. "Your job?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "Your job is supposed to be protecting and serving the community, not attacking the officers who actually do that work." The confrontation was attracting more attention now. Families with children were starting to look uncomfortable, and some were gathering their things to leave. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a platform for Morrison to air his grievances against internal affairs. Ray realized he needed to de-escalate the situation before it got completely out of hand. Morrison was drunk, angry, and feeling humiliated in front of his peers. That was a dangerous combination for any person, but especially for someone with a history of violence and a gun on his hip. "Look," Ray said in a quieter voice, hoping to bring the temperature down. "This isn't the time or place for this discussion. Why don't we talk about this tomorrow when we've both had a chance to cool down?" But Morrison wasn't interested in cooling down. If anything, Ray's reasonable tone seemed to make him angrier. In Morrison's mind, Ray was patronizing him, treating him like a child who couldn't control himself. "Don't talk down to me," Morrison snarled. "I've been a cop longer than you, and I've done more real police work in 1 year than you'll do in your entire career." Ray could see that reasoning with Morrison wasn't going to work. The man was too drunk and too angry to listen to logic. Chief Williams was getting closer, but she was still several tables away, slowed by having to navigate through the crowd and furniture. Ray made a decision. He was going to walk away, regardless of how it looked to the other officers. This confrontation wasn't going to end well if it continued, and there were too many innocent people in the room who could get hurt if things turned violent. "Have a good evening, Officer Morrison," Ray said, turning to leave. But Morrison wasn't finished. As Ray walked away, Morrison called after him with words that would change everything. "That's right. Walk away." Just like you walked away from real police work. Just like you'll walk away when this department really needs you. Ray paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He could feel Morrison's eyes on his back, along with the eyes of every other person in the room. What happened next would define not just this evening, but possibly his entire career and the future of his investigation. He turned around one more time, meeting Morrison's gaze across the crowded ballroom. Neither man spoke, but the challenge in Morrison's eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ray walked back into the ballroom with measured steps. He couldn't let Morrison's taunts go unanswered, not in front of the entire department. If he backed down now, every investigation he conducted would be seen as weak. Every officer would know they could intimidate him into submission. The Kevin Thompson case and all the other victims deserved better than that. The room fell silent as Ray approached Morrison's table. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children sensed the tension and moved closer to their parents. Even the hotel staff seemed to freeze, unsure whether to continue clearing dishes or find somewhere else to be. "Officer Morrison," Ray said in a clear voice that carried across the ballroom, "I need you to lower your voice and show some respect for the families here tonight." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? You've been investigating me for weeks, trying to destroy my reputation and my career. You call that respect? I call that doing my job. The same job that protects good officers from false accusations and holds bad officers accountable for their actions." The word bad hit Morrison like a slap in the face. His friends at the table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their plates very interesting. Everyone in the room knew what Ray was implying, and Morrison's reaction confirmed it. "Bad officer?" Morrison's voice rose to a near shout. "I've put my life on the line for this community every day for 12 years. I've arrested drug dealers and gang members while you sat behind a desk pushing papers. And now you want to call me a bad officer?" Chief Williams was pushing through the crowd now, her face showing the concern of a leader watching her department implode in public. But she was still too far away to intervene effectively. Captain Rodriguez was closer, but she seemed unsure how to handle a confrontation between two fellow officers. Ray noticed Morrison's hand moving toward his service weapon. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. But Ray had been a street cop long enough to recognize the gesture. Morrison was feeling cornered and threatened, and his training was telling him to be ready to defend himself. "Nobody's questioning your years of service," Ray said carefully, keeping his voice calm despite his growing alarm. "But that doesn't mean you're above the law or immune from investigation when complaints are filed. Complaints from criminals and gangbangers who would say anything to get a cop in trouble," Morrison shot back. "You believe them over your fellow officers? You believe them over me?" The racial undertones in Morrison's words were becoming clearer. Ray had seen this pattern in his investigation. Morrison had a particular hostility toward young black men, viewing them all as potential threats regardless of their actual behavior. Kevin Thompson had been just another face to Morrison, not a human being with hopes and dreams and a family who loved him. "I believe the evidence," Ray said, "and the evidence in Kevin Thompson's case doesn't support your version of events." Morrison's face went red with rage at the mention of Kevin's name. "That little thug tried to take my gun. I did what I had to do to protect myself and the community. The fact that you're questioning that shows exactly where your loyalties lie. My loyalty is to the truth and to justice for all citizens, regardless of their background or the color of their skin." The explicit mention of race sent Morrison over the edge. In his alcohol-clouded mind, Ray had just accused him of being a racist in front of his colleagues and their families. It was an accusation that struck at the core of how Morrison saw himself as a heroic protector of society. "How dare you," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "How dare you stand there and lecture me about race? I've served in neighborhoods where you wouldn't last 5 minutes. I've faced down criminals who would kill you without a second thought. And now you want to destroy my career because I had the courage to do what was necessary." Ray could see Morrison's hand, moving closer to his weapon. Other officers in the room were starting to notice too. A few of them were slowly moving their own hands toward their guns, unsure what was happening but ready to react if violence broke out. "Officer Morrison, I need you to calm down and step back," Ray said in his most authoritative voice. "This conversation is over." But Morrison wasn't interested in backing down. 12 years of getting away with misconduct had convinced him that he was untouchable. The alcohol had removed his last bit of self-control, and Ray's investigation threatened to expose everything he had done over the years. "No, this conversation is just getting started," Morrison said, taking a step closer to Ray. "You think you can sit in your fancy office and judge officers who do real work? You think you can destroy careers based on lies from criminals?" Ray could smell the alcohol on Morrison's breath and see the wildness in his eyes. This was a man who had completely lost control, and the situation was becoming dangerous for everyone in the room. "Security. I need security to the ballroom immediately," Chief Williams called out as she finally reached the area where the confrontation was taking place. But the hotel security guards were not equipped to handle a dispute between armed police officers. Morrison ignored the chief's presence, focused entirely on Ray. "You know what your problem is? You forgot what it means to be a cop. You forgot that we're supposed to stick together against the criminals and troublemakers who want to destroy everything we've built. What we've built is supposed to be trust with the community," Ray replied. "When officers abuse their power, they destroy that trust and make it harder for all of us to do our jobs effectively." Morrison's laugh was bitter and angry. "Trust? You want to talk about trust? What about the trust between officers? What about backing up your fellow cops when they make split-second decisions in life or death situations? I'll back up any officer who follows the law and department policy. But I won't cover up misconduct or protect officers who abuse their authority." The word abuse was the final trigger. Morrison's face contorted with rage as he fully processed what Ray was saying. In Morrison's mind, Ray wasn't just investigating him professionally. Ray was attacking his character, his integrity, and everything he believed about himself. "You sanctimonious piece of garbage," Morrison snarled. "You think you're better than everyone else because you sit in judgment of real cops who do real work." Ray saw Morrison's hand move to his weapon and knew the situation was about to escalate beyond words. Other officers in the room saw it too, and began moving away from the confrontation, some of them herding family members toward the exits. "Officer Morrison, I order you to step back and calm down," Chief Williams said, finally reaching the immediate area of the confrontation. But Morrison was beyond listening to orders from anyone. "I'm not taking orders from people who protect criminals over cops," Morrison said, his hand now resting on the grip of his service weapon. Ray felt time slowing down as he watched Morrison's movements. He had been in dangerous situations before, but never like this. Never with a fellow officer who was armed and clearly unstable. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, investigating Morrison for using excessive force, and now Morrison was threatening him with that same violence. "Morrison, don't do this," Ray said quietly. "Think about your family, think about your career, think about all the people watching." But Morrison was beyond rational thought. The alcohol, the anger, and the humiliation had combined to create a perfect storm of poor judgment. In his twisted logic, Ray had become the enemy, and enemies needed to be dealt with decisively. "My career is already destroyed because of you," Morrison said. "My reputation is already ruined because of your so-called investigation. What else do I have to lose?" Ray realized with growing horror that Morrison was serious. This wasn't just bluster or intimidation. Morrison was actually considering drawing his weapon in a room full of police officers and their families. The man had completely lost touch with reality. "You have everything to lose," Ray said desperately. "Your freedom, your family's future, your pension. Don't throw it all away because you're angry." But Morrison wasn't listening anymore. His hand was moving toward his weapon with deliberate purpose. Ray could see other officers reaching for their guns, unsure whether to intervene or protect themselves. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than anyone could stop it. Captain Rodriguez was shouting into her radio, calling for backup, even though they were surrounded by police officers. Parents were grabbing their children and moving toward the exits. Hotel staff were ducking behind tables and calling 911, not realizing that the emergency was happening between the very people they would normally call for help. Ray made a split-second decision. Instead of reaching for his own weapon, he raised his hand slowly and took a step back. He was hoping that a non-threatening gesture might help Morrison realize how far he had gone and give him a chance to reconsider. "Morrison, look around," Ray said softly. "Look at all these families, look at your fellow officers, this isn't who you want to be." For a moment, Morrison seemed to hesitate. His eyes flicked around the room, taking in the frightened faces of children and the shocked expressions of his colleagues. Some part of his rational mind was trying to break through the alcohol and anger. But then his gaze fell back on Ray, and the hatred returned in full force. In Morrison's mind, Ray was responsible for all of this. Ray was the one who had started the investigation that threatened to expose his misconduct. Ray was the one who had challenged him publicly and made him look bad in front of his peers. "This is all your fault," Morrison said, his voice filled with venom. "Everything that happens tonight is because of you and your witch hunt." Ray watched, in horror, as Morrison's hand closed around the grip of his service weapon. The room erupted in shouts and screams as people realized what was about to happen, but it was too late to stop it. Morrison drew his gun. The ballroom, that had been filled with celebration just hours earlier, was now a scene of terror and chaos. Children were crying, adults were screaming, and police officers were drawing their own weapons, unsure who was the threat and who was the victim. Ray found himself staring down the barrel of Morrison's service weapon, held by a drunk and enraged officer who had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The investigation into Kevin Thompson's death had led to this moment, where another life hung in the balance and the entire police department's reputation was about to be destroyed on live video. Because in the modern world, nothing stays private. Cell phones were already recording, capturing every word and every gesture for the world to see. By tomorrow morning, this confrontation would be on every news channel and social media platform in the country. Ray realized that his investigation had been successful in one way. Morrison was about to reveal his true character to everyone watching. The question now was whether Ray would survive to see the consequences. The ballroom froze in absolute silence. Morrison stood with his service weapon drawn and pointed directly at Ray's chest. The only sounds were the quiet sobs of frightened children and the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning system. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving, afraid that any sudden motion might trigger a catastrophe. Ray kept his hands raised and his eyes locked on Morrison's face, not the gun. He had been trained that looking at the weapon would only increase his own fear and make it harder to think clearly. Morrison's finger was on the trigger and his hand was shaking slightly from a combination of alcohol and adrenaline. "Morrison, put the gun down," Chief Williams commanded from about 10 feet away. She had her own weapon drawn but wasn't pointing it at Morrison yet. The last thing anyone wanted was a shootout in a room full of innocent people. "Stay back," Morrison shouted without taking his eyes off Ray. "This is between me and him. This is about justice for real cops who do real work." Captain Rodriguez was moving slowly around the edge of the confrontation, trying to position herself where she could intervene if necessary. Other officers were creating a protective barrier between Morrison and the families, many of whom were still trying to get to the exits. "Think about what you're doing," Ray said calmly, though his heart was pounding. "You're a police officer. You took an oath to protect and serve. This isn't protecting anyone." Morrison's face was twisted with rage and alcohol-induced confusion. "I've been protecting this community for 12 years while you sat behind a desk, and this is how I get repaid? With accusations and investigations from someone who's never done real police work?" "Investigating misconduct is real police work," Ray replied. "It protects good officers and innocent citizens. It's what makes the badge mean something." "The badge means courage and sacrifice," Morrison snarled. "It means standing up to criminals and troublemakers, even when bleeding-heart administrators don't have the stomach for real justice." Ray could see that Morrison was beyond rational argument. The man had convinced himself that he was the victim in this situation, that his career was being destroyed by political correctness rather than his own actions. In Morrison's mind, pointing a gun at a fellow officer was somehow justified. "Officer Morrison, I'm ordering you to holster your weapon immediately," Chief Williams said in her most authoritative voice. This behavior is completely unacceptable and will result in immediate termination and criminal charges. Morrison laughed bitterly. Termination? You think I care about this job anymore? You think I care about working for a department that protects criminals over cops? You should care about your family, Ray said quietly. Your wife, your kids. They're going to have to live with whatever you do here tonight. Don't destroy their lives because you're angry with me. For a moment, Morrison's expression softened slightly. Ray could see him thinking about his family, considering the consequences of his actions. But then the anger returned, fueled by alcohol and a sense of persecution that had been building for months. My family will understand that I stood up for what's right, Morrison said. They'll understand that I refused to let corrupt administrators destroy everything I've worked for. Ray realized that Morrison had completely lost touch with reality. The man genuinely believed that he was the hero in this situation, that drawing a weapon on a fellow officer in front of dozens of witnesses was somehow justified. It was the same mentality that had led to Kevin Thompson's death and all the other incidents Ray had uncovered. Lieutenant Thompson, who supervised the patrol division, was trying to clear the remaining civilians from the ballroom. Parents were carrying their children toward the exits while other officers created protective barriers. But many people were still in the room, unable to escape quickly because of the crowd and the furniture. This needs to end now, Captain Rodriguez said, moving closer to Morrison's position. You're scaring children and traumatizing families. Whatever issues you have with internal affairs, this isn't the way to resolve them. Morrison swung the gun toward Rodriguez briefly before pointing it back at Ray. Don't come any closer. I know what I'm doing. No, you don't, Ray said firmly. You're drunk and you're angry and you're making the worst mistake of your life. But it's not too late to stop this. Put the gun down and we can talk about your concerns through proper channels. Proper channels? Morrison's voice rose to a shout. I tried proper channels. I tried explaining my actions through reports and interviews. But you've already made up your mind that I'm guilty. You've already decided to destroy my career based on lies from criminals. Ray could see cell phones recording the confrontation from multiple angles. By tomorrow, this incident would be seen by millions of people around the world. Morrison's reputation and the department's credibility were being destroyed in real time, broadcast live on social media. The only person destroying your career is you, Ray said. Right now, at this moment, you're proving everything I suspected about your judgment and your fitness to carry a badge. Morrison's face contorted with rage. You arrogant piece of garbage. You think you're so much better than everyone else. You think you can sit in judgment of officers who risk their lives while you push papers in a safe office? I think officers should be held to the same standards as everyone else, Ray replied. I think we should protect and serve all citizens, not just the ones who look like us or act the way we think they should. The racial implications of Ray's words hit Morrison like a physical blow. In his alcohol-clouded mind, Ray had just accused him of being a racist in front of the entire department. It was an accusation that went to the core of how Morrison saw himself. How dare you? Morrison whispered, his voice filled with venom. How dare you question my integrity? I've served this community with honor and distinction for 12 years. Honor doesn't include shooting unarmed teenagers in the back, Ray said, finally deciding to confront Morrison directly about Kevin Thompson's death. The mention of Kevin Thompson sent Morrison completely over the edge. His face turned purple with rage and his hand tightened on the gun. That little thug was reaching for my weapon. I did what I had to do to protect myself and the community. 6 witnesses say he was running away when you shot him. The forensic evidence shows the bullet entered his back. Your story doesn't match the facts. Morrison was shaking with rage now, barely able to control himself. Witnesses lie. Evidence can be misinterpreted. But I know what happened that night, and I know I did the right thing. Chief Williams had positioned herself where she had a clear shot at Morrison if necessary, but she was obviously reluctant to use deadly force against one of her own officers. The situation was unprecedented and dangerous, with no clear protocol for handling an armed confrontation between police officers. Morrison, listen to me, Lieutenant Thompson said from across the room. I've known you for 8 years. You're Good cop who's made a bad decision tonight. But it's not too late to fix this. Put the gun down and we can work through whatever problems you're facing. Morrison looked around the room, seeing the frightened faces of his colleagues and their families. For a moment, he seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had done. But instead of feeling remorse, he seemed to become more desperate and dangerous. "It's too late," Morrison said quietly. "My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. Everything I've worked for is gone because of him and his investigation." Ray realized that Morrison was beyond reasoning. The man had convinced himself that he had nothing left to lose, which made him extremely dangerous. Desperate people do desperate things, and Morrison was as desperate as anyone Ray had ever encountered. "You still have your freedom," Ray said. "You still have your family. You still have a future if you put that gun down right now." But Morrison wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had taken on a wild, unfocused look that Ray recognized from his years on the street. It was the look of someone who had made peace with violence, who had decided that the consequences no longer mattered. "My future was destroyed the day you started your witch hunt," Morrison said. "Everything that happens from here is your fault." Ray saw Morrison's finger tightening on the trigger and knew that talking was no longer an option. Whatever happened next would determine whether anyone walked out of this ballroom alive. Captain Rodriguez saw it too. In one fluid motion, she drew her weapon and aimed it at Morrison's back. "Jake, don't do this. Drop your weapon now or I will drop you." Morrison spun around to face Rodriguez, momentarily taking the gun off Ray. It was the opening everyone had been waiting for. 3 officers moved simultaneously, rushing Morrison from different angles while his attention was divided. The gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the ballroom. People screamed and dove for cover, not knowing who had been shot or whether more gunfire would follow. Hotel security guards who had been afraid to intervene against armed police officers suddenly found themselves in the middle of a full-scale battle. Morrison went down hard, tackled by Officer Davis. From the robbery division, the gun skittered across the floor as Morrison hit the ground, no longer a threat to anyone. Captain Rodriguez kept her weapon trained on him while other officers secured the scene. Ray stood frozen for a moment, his ears ringing from the gunshot and his mind trying to process what had just happened. He looked around the ballroom, which now looked like a war zone. Tables were overturned, chairs were scattered, and terrified families were huddled against the walls. But no one had been shot. The bullet had gone into the ceiling when Morrison was tackled, and the only injury was to Morrison himself, who had hit his head on a table leg when he fell. Blood was trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, but he was conscious and moving. Chief Williams was already on her radio, calling for paramedics and additional backup. The incident was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Morrison's career was finished, his freedom was in jeopardy, and the entire department would face scrutiny over how one of their officers had been allowed to spiral so far out of control. As Morrison was handcuffed and read his rights, Ray couldn't help but think about Kevin Thompson, the young man who had died for no reason other than Morrison's racism and poor judgment. Tonight's incident had vindicated Ray's investigation and exposed Morrison's true character, but it came at a terrible cost. The department would survive this scandal, but it would take years to rebuild the trust that had been shattered in those terrifying minutes when one of their own had pointed a gun at a fellow officer in front of dozens of witnesses. Ray looked around the ballroom one more time, seeing the frightened faces of children who would never forget what they had witnessed tonight. He had done his job and exposed the truth about Morrison, but he wondered if the price had been too high. Justice had been served, but it had come at the cost of innocence lost and trust broken. And in the end, that might be the most tragic consequence of all. The video went viral within 3 hours. By midnight, clips of Morrison drawing his weapon on Ray were being shared across every major social media platform. The hashtag police accountability was trending worldwide, and news crews were already gathering outside the police station despite the late hour. Ray sat in his office at 2 a.m, watching the coverage on his computer screen. The footage was crystal clear, shot from multiple angles by officers' family members who had been attending what was supposed to be a celebration. There was no way to spin what had happened or claim it was taken out of context. The entire confrontation was captured in high definition from Morrison's drunken taunts to the moment he drew his weapon. Chief Williams knocked on his door and entered without waiting for permission. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect uniform wrinkled and her hair disheveled. She had spent the past 4 hours dealing with reporters, city officials, and federal investigators who were already demanding answers. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting down across from Ray's desk. "I keep thinking about all those kids who saw it happen," Ray replied. "They came to celebrate their parents, and instead, they witnessed something that will probably give them nightmares for years. That's on Morrison, not you. You handled yourself with remarkable professionalism under impossible circumstances." Ray appreciated her support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he could have done something differently. Maybe if he had walked away earlier or refused to engage with Morrison's provocations, the situation wouldn't have escalated to violence. "The FBI called an hour ago," Chief Williams continued. "They're opening a civil rights investigation into Morrison and possibly the entire department. They want to interview you first thing tomorrow morning." "What about Morrison? Where is he?" "Now, county jail. He's been charged with aggravated assault, terroristic threats, and civil rights violations. The district attorney says more charges are likely once they review all the evidence from your investigation." Ray nodded, though he felt no satisfaction in Morrison's arrest. The confrontation had vindicated his investigation, but it had come at too high a cost. The department's reputation was in shambles, and public trust in law enforcement had taken another devastating blow. "There's something else," Chief Williams said hesitantly. "Morrison's lawyer is already claiming that his client was under extreme stress due to a malicious investigation. He's trying to paint you as the villain who drove a good cop to have a breakdown." Ray had expected this defense strategy. Morrison would try to portray himself as a victim of political correctness and excessive oversight. It was the same narrative he had used throughout his career to justify questionable behavior. "Let him try," Ray said. "The evidence speaks for itself. Kevin Thompson's death, the witness statements, the pattern of complaints. Morrison's actions tonight just proved what kind of officer he really was." The next morning brought a media circus, unlike anything the police department had ever experienced. News vans lined the street outside headquarters, and reporters shouted questions at anyone who entered or left the building. Ray arrived early, using the back entrance to avoid the cameras. The FBI interview lasted 4 hours. Special Agent Linda Foster was thorough but professional, asking detailed questions about Ray's investigation into Morrison and the events leading up to the confrontation. Ray provided copies of all his files, including witness statements and forensic evidence that had been overlooked or suppressed in previous investigations. "How many other officers knew about Morrison's behavior?" Agent Foster asked. "Several witnessed questionable incidents over the years, but most stayed silent. There's a culture of protecting fellow officers even when they cross the line." "And the previous internal affairs investigations into Morrison?" "Inadequate. Witnesses weren't properly interviewed. Evidence wasn't thoroughly examined, and complaints were often dismissed without sufficient justification." Agent Foster made extensive notes and promised that the federal investigation would be comprehensive. She seemed particularly interested in the institutional failures that had allowed Morrison to continue working despite numerous red flags. The fallout from the incident spread quickly through the department. Several officers who had been friends with Morrison requested transfers to other divisions, unwilling to be associated with his actions. Others came forward with information about misconduct they had previously kept quiet, hoping to distance themselves from the scandal. Within a week, Ray's investigation had expanded from Morrison to include 3 other officers who had similar patterns of complaints and questionable incidents. The federal probe grew accordingly, with FBI agents interviewing dozens of current and former officers about the department's culture and accountability practices. The police union initially tried to defend Morrison, issuing a statement about officers working under difficult conditions and making split-second decisions. But as video of the confrontation continued to circulate, and more details emerged about Morrison's history, the union quietly distanced itself from his case. No one wanted to be seen defending an officer who had drawn a weapon on a colleague. In front of families, Kevin Thompson's family held a press conference 2 weeks after the incident. Kevin's mother, Patricia Thompson, stood at a podium surrounded by lawyers and civil rights activists. Her voice was strong but filled with emotion as she spoke about her son. Kevin was a good boy who was trying to make something of his life. He didn't deserve to die, and his death didn't deserve to be covered up. We're grateful that Detective Johnson had the courage to investigate the truth, even when it put him in danger. The family announced they were filing a federal lawsuit against the city and Morrison personally. They also established a foundation in Kevin's name to provide scholarships for young people from disadvantaged neighborhoods who wanted to pursue higher education. Ray watched the press conference from his office, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served for Kevin Thompson, but it had taken too long and come at too high a cost. The young man's life could never be brought back, and his family would carry the pain of his loss forever. The criminal case against Morrison moved quickly through the courts. The video evidence was overwhelming, and Morrison's lawyer eventually advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial. Morrison agreed to plead guilty to federal civil rights violations and state charges of aggravated assault in exchange for a sentence of 5 years in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, Morrison finally showed some remorse for his actions. He apologized to Ray, to the department, and to the families who witnessed the confrontation. But he never specifically apologized to Kevin Thompson's family or acknowledged wrongdoing in the shooting. "I let my emotions get the better of me," Morrison said to the judge. "I know what I did was wrong and I accept responsibility for my actions that night. But I want everyone to know that I served this community with honor for 12 years, and one bad decision doesn't erase all the good work I did." Ray was in the courtroom for the sentencing. He felt no satisfaction watching Morrison led away in handcuffs, just a sense that justice had finally been served. The system had worked, albeit slowly and imperfectly. The broader institutional changes took longer to implement. The FBI's investigation resulted in a consent decree requiring the police department to undergo comprehensive reform. New policies were put in place for investigating officer misconduct, and an independent oversight board was established to review internal affairs cases. Ray was promoted to deputy chief in charge of professional standards, overseeing not just internal affairs but also training and policy development. His first initiative was mandatory bias training for all officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. The training program included a detailed case study of the Kevin Thompson shooting and the Morrison incident. New officers learned about the importance of accountability and the consequences of misconduct not just for individual officers but for the entire profession. 6 months after the ballroom confrontation, Ray received a letter from a young police officer in another state. The officer had seen the video and read about Ray's investigation. He was facing his own ethical dilemma, witnessing misconduct by a senior officer and unsure whether to report it. "Your example gave me the courage to do the right thing," the officer wrote. "I know it won't be easy, but I can't stay silent when I see injustice. Thank you for showing that good cops have a responsibility to hold bad cops accountable." Ray kept the letter on his desk as a reminder of why his work mattered. The Morrison case had been traumatic and costly, but it had also sent a message throughout law enforcement that misconduct would not be tolerated, no matter who committed it or how long it had been ignored. The empty seat at the awards banquet had become a symbol of accountability in policing. Not the empty seat where Morrison should have been sitting, but the seat that Kevin Thompson would never fill because his life had been cut short by an officer who believed he was above the law. Ray often thought about the families who had witnessed the confrontation that night. Many of them had children who asked difficult questions about police officers and whether they could be trusted. Some of those children might grow up to be police officers themselves, and Ray hoped they would remember what they had seen and be determined to be better. The reforms were working slowly but steadily. Complaint investigations were more thorough, officers were receiving better training on bias and de-escalation, and the culture of silence that had protected bad cops was beginning to crack. There were still problems, still officers who resisted change, and still cases that required careful investigation. But the Morrison incident had created a watershed moment for the department and for law enforcement more broadly. The video of an officer drawing a weapon on a colleague had shocked the public and forced a reckoning that was long overdue. Ray's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Agent Foster from the FBI, calling with an update on the federal investigation. "We've completed our review of the department's practices over the past 5 years," she said. "The patterns of misconduct were more extensive than we initially thought. We're recommending additional reforms and ongoing federal oversight." Ray wasn't surprised. The Morrison case had been just the beginning, revealing a system that had failed to hold officers accountable for years. But change was coming, slowly and sometimes painfully, but inevitably. As he hung up the phone, Ray looked out his window at the police officers coming and going from headquarters. Most of them were good people trying to do a difficult job under challenging circumstances. They deserved better leadership and better systems that would support them when they did right and hold them accountable when they did wrong. The Morrison case had ended one officer's career and transformed an entire department. It had shown that accountability was possible, even when it came at a high price. And it had honored the memory of Kevin Thompson by ensuring that his death would not be forgotten or ignored. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the foundation had been laid for a better future. A future where officers like Morrison would be stopped before they could hurt innocent people, and where good officers like Ray would have the support they needed to do what was right. The work was far from over, but for the first time since he had taken over internal affairs, Ray felt hopeful about the future of law enforcement. Change was possible, justice was achievable, and accountability was becoming more than just a word in the department's mission statement. It was becoming a reality.